Welcome to Haunted Voice Channel. Before we get started, just a quick reminder, there are minimal ads in this video. If you enjoy the content, please hit the like button and subscribe. It really helps me create more stories for you. Also, I'd love to know where you're from and what time you're watching. I hope you enjoy the stories, and thank you so much for tuning in. Now, let's get started. It was just past dusk when I made my way down the old trail, the familiar crunch of pine needles underfoot blending with the distant call of a whippoorwill. I'd worked at Blackwood National Park for nearly 5 years, guiding tourists, keeping the trails clear, and occasionally dealing with campers who didn't know a bear-proof canister from a garbage bag. But that evening I was alone, performing my final sweep before heading back to the station. Or at least, I thought I was alone. It was early autumn and the air had that crisp bite, smelling faintly of decaying leaves and damp earth. The woods were thick with shadows, darker than usual, and even with my flashlight, visibility was low. But I knew these trails like the back of my hand, or so I thought. I was nearly to the clearing where I'd checked the last campsite when I saw it. Movement out of the corner of my eye. I whipped my flashlight around, catching only a fleeting glimpse of something darting between the trees. Too big to be a deer, too fast to be a bear. It was low to the ground with a hunched, loping gait, almost like it was crawling. I shook it off as a trick of the light, my mind conjuring up shapes from shadows. That's when I heard the laughter. At first I thought it was a coyote or maybe a pair of raccoons. But as I stood there straining to listen, it sounded too human, too deliberate. The laughter was hollow, almost mocking, and it seemed to echo from all around me. I raised my flashlight again, sweeping it across the trees, but there was nothing. Just the eerie quiet of the woods. My radio crackled at my hip, startling me out of my thoughts. "Ranger Stevens, do you copy?" It was Dan, the other ranger on duty that night. I lifted the radio to my mouth. "I copy. I'm just doing the last sweep." "Good," he replied, a hint of worry in his voice. "Had a couple of reports from campers saying they heard weird noises out there. You sure everything's okay?" "Yeah," I lied, though I wasn't so sure anymore. "Probably just some kids playing a prank." Dan paused. "Just be careful, all right? There's been some strange things reported in that area lately. I'll catch you back at the station." I clipped the radio back to my belt, trying to shake the creeping unease that was settling into my bones. I forced myself to move forward, rationalizing that the laughter could have been anything. An echo, an animal, my own nerves playing tricks on me. But the further I walked, the thicker the air felt, like I was wading through molasses. And then I found it, the campsite, or rather what was left of it. The tent was shredded, the sleeping bags torn open as if by some massive, clawed creature. I knelt to examine the damage, and that's when I noticed the tracks. They were deep, canine, but far too large, with elongated claw marks. My heart hammered in my chest, and I stood, scanning the area, straining my ears for any sound. That's when I heard it again, the laughter, but this time it was closer. And with it came a voice. "Ranger." It was a whisper, a low guttural growl that seemed to crawl out from the shadows themselves. I spun around, flashlight casting frantic beams into the darkness, trying to find the source. My hand drifted to the knife at my belt, though I doubted it'd do me any good. Then I saw it, a figure lurking just beyond the reach of my light. At first it looked like a man, tall, lanky, with glowing eyes reflecting back at me. But as I watched, its limbs began to distort, shifting into unnatural angles, its jaw elongating into something that wasn't human. I took a step back, my breath hitching, but my legs felt like they were locked in place. It stepped forward, its form flickering, like a static image trying to break free. I knew enough about the local legends to understand what I was seeing. A skinwalker, a creature of the woods, something ancient and unspeakable. But there was something else too, something deeper in those eyes. Recognition. "Ranger, it repeated, stretching its mouth into a grotesque smile. And then it started to change. Right before my eyes, the creature's form began to shift again, but this time it morphed into something disturbingly familiar. It took on my own face, my uniform, my flashlight. It mimicked my posture perfectly, tilting its head just like I did, even reaching down to where my knife was. It was me. In that moment, I realized the truth. This wasn't just a random encounter. This thing had been following me, watching me, learning from me. It wasn't just any skinwalker. It was here for me. A sense of dread washed over me as I realized that if this thing could become me, it could take my place. Nobody would ever know the difference. I stumbled back, the weight of the realization nearly knocking me off my feet. I turned to run, knowing that if I stayed, it would take me, replace me, and no one would ever be the wiser. As I broke through the tree line and ran back to the station, I could still hear that mocking laughter following me, echoing through the woods. When I finally made it back, Dan looked at me, his eyes widening with concern. "You okay, man? You look like you've seen a ghost." But as I looked into his eyes, I saw a flicker of something familiar. A glint. A reflection that shouldn't have been there. My blood ran cold as the horrifying realization dawned on me. Dan's smile stretched a little too wide, and in that moment I knew that I hadn't escaped at all. I'd brought it back with me. It was supposed to be a weekend getaway, just me and my old friend Matt camping in Deadfall Woods. We both needed a break from the grind of city life, and the remote wilderness seemed like the perfect place to unwind. Deadfall was famous for its miles of untouched forest, and as a bonus it was far enough off the grid that we wouldn't have to deal with anyone else. We set up camp near a stream and spent the day fishing, drinking, and trading stories. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the forest transformed. The warm golden light was replaced by shadows that stretched between the trees, and a heavy silence settled over everything. It was like the woods were holding their breath. We built a fire and settled in for the night. Matt started telling ghost stories, just like old times. But after a while, I noticed he kept looking over his shoulder into the dark trees behind us. When I asked him about it, he shrugged it off, saying he thought he'd heard something. I laughed, chalking it up to the eerie atmosphere. But deep down, I felt it too. That prickling sensation, like we were being watched. Around midnight, we heard a woman's voice, faint and distant, calling for help. Matt and I froze, listening. The voice called out again, a little louder this time, echoing through the trees. We exchanged a look, and without a word, grabbed our flashlights and headed into the woods. As we walked, the voice grew louder, more desperate, but we couldn't seem to get any closer. It was as if the sound was moving, leading us deeper into the forest. After about 15 minutes, I stopped, realizing that we were completely off the trail. When I mentioned this to Matt, he just nodded, his face pale in the beam of my flashlight. "We should go back," I said, suddenly uneasy. But before he could respond, we heard it again, only this time it was right behind us. I spun around, shining my light into the trees, but there was nothing there, just shadows and silence. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. A figure stepped into the light, and my blood ran cold. It was the woman, or at least something that looked like a woman. She was tall, impossibly thin, with skin so pale it seemed to glow. Her face was blank, featureless, as if someone had wiped it clean. But it was the eyes that got me. Dark, empty pits that seemed to swallow the light. She opened her mouth, but instead of words, an unnatural chittering sound came out. I stumbled back, nearly dropping my flashlight. The woman reached out, her fingers long and twisted, and I could see her joints bending the wrong way, like she was made of broken bones. "Run!" Matt screamed, and we bolted, crashing through the underbrush, not caring where we were going as long as it was away from her. I could hear her behind us, moving too fast, her footsteps heavy and uneven, like she was crawling and walking at the same time. We ran until we burst into a clearing, gasping for breath. For a moment I thought we'd lost her. But then I noticed something that stopped me cold. The ground was littered with old, tattered clothes, shirts, jackets, even shoes, all scattered around like someone had just vanished out of them. Matt knelt down, picking up a faded baseball cap. "These are recent," he whispered, his voice shaking. And that's when I saw it, a worn-out ranger's hat, half buried in the dirt. There hadn't been a ranger station in Deadfall for years. I remembered hearing stories about how the park used to have a full-time ranger, but he'd disappeared, along with several campers back in the 1980s. They'd shut down the park after that. But eventually people started coming back, treating the stories as nothing more than campfire tales. I felt a chill run down my spine. Those weren't just stories. These were the forgotten ones, the lost souls who had disappeared in Deadfall, still trapped here, calling out for help to anyone who would listen. A rustling sound came from the edge of the clearing. I looked up and saw the woman again, but this time she wasn't alone. Figures were emerging from the trees, one by one, pale and faceless, each one more twisted and broken than the last. They moved in unison, a silent army of the lost, surrounding us. Matt grabbed my arm, pulling me back. "We need to go. Now." We turned and ran, but it was like the forest was working against us. The trees seemed to close in, the branches reaching out like fingers, clawing at our clothes and skin. No matter which direction we went, the clearing was always there waiting for us. Finally, in a last desperate attempt, we dove into the underbrush, crawling and scrambling until we broke through to the trail. We didn't stop running until we reached our campsite. The fire was still burning, and the sight of it felt like a lifeline. We grabbed our gear and left everything else behind. As we drove out of Deadfall, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw them, standing at the edge of the road watching us go. I swear I saw a figure wearing a ranger's hat among them, staring with those empty, hollow eyes. We never talked about what happened that night, but I haven't been back to Deadfall since. I don't think I ever will. The park is still open, though, and every so often I hear about another group of campers who went missing, another hiker who vanished without a trace. And sometimes, late at night, I'll hear a voice in my dreams, calling out from the darkness asking for help. I'll wake up drenched in sweat, the echo of that voice lingering in my mind. I know it's them, the forgotten ones, still trapped in those woods, waiting for the next unlucky soul to answer their call. So, if you ever find yourself in Deadfall Woods and you hear someone calling for help, do yourself a favor. Don't answer. Because once you're in, you may never find your way back out. I had always considered myself an outdoorsman. I loved the feeling of isolation, the whisper of the trees, and the cool, undisturbed air of the forest. So, when I heard about the quiet beauty of Blackwood Forest, I packed my tent and supplies, ready for a weekend of solitude and reflection. But Blackwood Forest, it was unlike any place I'd ever been. It's been weeks since I returned, but the memories cling to me, their weight sinking into my bones, their chill invading my nights. The first sign that something was wrong came as the last light of day drained from the sky. I had set up my camp in a small clearing, nestled between towering pines that seemed to lean in on me, as though curious about this stranger in their midst. The forest was deathly silent, more so than any place I'd ever been. No rustle of animals, no chirping of birds, just the stillness pressing in on all sides. It was then I first noticed the smell, a faint rotting odor, like something that had died and been left to fester. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself that it was just the forest playing tricks on me, my mind conjuring smells out of the thick, humid air. But it lingered, following me as I set up my tent and built a small fire. I ate in silence, my senses on high alert, but I saw nothing unusual. The silence seemed to deepen, and every crackle of the fire sounded like a gunshot, reverberating through the trees. I tried to shake the unease, chalking it up to nerves, but then came the footsteps. They started faint, almost imperceptible, just a soft crunching in the underbrush. I turned quickly, peering into the darkness beyond the fire's reach, but there was nothing there. I told myself it was probably a deer or a raccoon, maybe just a figment of my imagination, but the steps didn't stop. They circled my campsite, slow and deliberate, pausing every few steps as though whoever or whatever it was wanted me to know they were there. I reached for my flashlight and swept it across the trees, but the beam seemed to only deepen the shadows, stretching them into grotesque shapes that danced on the edge of my vision. I held my breath, listening, and for a moment there was silence. Then I heard it, a low, guttural growl, so deep that I felt it in my chest. It was followed by a strange clicking sound, like claws tapping on stone. My heart pounded, and I took a shaky step back, my mind racing with fear. Suddenly, I saw a figure dart between the trees, too fast to make out any details. But it was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that moved in a way that was wrong, bending and twisting as though they had too many joints. My blood turned to ice as I watched it disappear into the darkness, the smell of rot growing stronger, almost choking me. I stumbled back to the fire, clutching my flashlight as though it could protect me. The footsteps started again, now louder, closer, and I could hear faint whispers mixed in with the growls, words that I couldn't quite make out. Panic gripped me, and I fumbled for my phone, desperate for some connection to the outside world. But of course, there was no signal. I was alone, truly alone, with whatever horror lurked in the trees. As I frantically searched for something, anything that might help me, I noticed a figure approaching from the shadows. It was a park ranger, his uniform dirty and torn, his eyes wide and staring. Relief flooded through me, and I called out to him, but he didn't respond. He simply stood there, watching me with an expression that was almost pitying. "They don't like outsiders," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "You need to leave. Now." Before I could ask him what he meant, he turned and vanished into the woods, moving with a speed that seemed unnatural, almost inhuman. I scrambled to pack up my things, my hands shaking as the growls grew louder and the footsteps closed in around me. I didn't look back as I ran, the darkness pressing in on all sides, the feeling of being watched gnawing at me with every step. As I burst from the trees, I found myself on an unfamiliar trail, but I didn't stop to question it. I just kept running, desperate to escape the unseen horrors that lurked in the forest. But as I neared the edge of the woods, something caught my eye, a small wooden sign, half hidden by vines and dirt. I brushed it off, hoping for some clue about where I was, but what I saw made my blood run cold. It was a weathered photograph of a man in a park ranger uniform, smiling at the camera. Beneath it, a date was scrawled in faded ink. It was from 1975. The same man I had just seen in the woods, the one who had warned me to leave. His eyes stared back at me from the photograph, hollow and empty. I turned and ran, the ranger's words echoing in my mind, and behind me, I heard the growls and whispers resume, louder than before. The forest seemed to close in, the trees bending toward me, their twisted limbs reaching, grasping as though they wanted to keep me there forever. And now, even in the safety of my home, I can't shake the feeling that I'm still being watched. I never did find Blackwood Forest on any map, and sometimes late at night I swear I hear footsteps outside my window, slow and deliberate, circling, waiting. And now, even in the safety of my home, I can't shake the feeling that I'm still being watched. I never did find Blackwood Forest on any map, and sometimes late at night, I swear I hear footsteps outside my window, slow and deliberate, circling, waiting. I've always felt at home in the wilderness, but this time things were different. This camping trip wasn't just about enjoying nature, it was about escaping my own life. After a rough breakup and quitting a job I hated, I needed time to reset. So I packed up my gear and drove out to an isolated spot deep in the Appalachian woods. It was a place my grandfather used to take me when I was a kid, full of memories and hidden trails. I thought it would be comforting. The first 2 days were uneventful, if a little lonely. I hiked through familiar paths, remembering stories my grandfather used to tell about the strange things he'd seen out here. Glowing eyes in the night, shadows that moved without anything to cast them. At the time, I thought he was just trying to scare me. But on the third night, as I sat by the campfire, those stories started to feel a little too real. It began as a distant noise, a low hum that seemed to vibrate through the trees. At first, I thought it might be the wind, but then it grew louder, more rhythmic, like a pulse. It wasn't coming from any particular direction, but seemed to resonate from all around me. I stood up, looking around, but the forest was dark and still. I shook it off, assuming it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Later, as I crawled into my tent, I heard it again. This time it was closer, almost like chanting. Low, guttural voices, saying words I couldn't understand. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent, shining the light into the trees, but there was nothing there. Just the shadows and that terrible, pulsating hum. I sat there waiting, hoping it would stop, but it only seemed to grow louder, vibrating in my bones. I barely slept that night. The chanting eventually faded, but I could still feel the hum under my skin, as if it had settled into my bones. By morning I was exhausted, but determined not to let it ruin my trip. I set off to explore a part of the woods I'd never ventured into before, hoping the distraction would clear my head. The further I walked, the more I noticed something odd. The trees in this area were twisted, almost bent over as if they'd been forced to grow in unnatural directions. I found strange markings carved into the bark, patterns that seemed familiar, but I couldn't quite place them. They looked almost like old runes or symbols, and the sight of them filled me with a deep, unsettling feeling. I decided it was best to turn back, but as I did, I saw something strange on the ground. It was a small wooden figure, carved roughly into the shape of a person, with twisted limbs and a face contorted in a silent scream. It looked ancient, weathered, and I felt a chill run through me as I picked it up. It was too deliberate to be a random piece of debris. Someone had left it there, maybe even as a warning. That night I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I sat by the fire, clutching my flashlight, every sound in the forest amplified by my nerves. Around midnight, I heard footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling my campsite. I couldn't see anything, but I knew something was out there watching me. I called out, hoping it was just a lost hiker, but there was no response. Just the slow crunching of leaves as whatever it was moved closer. I scrambled back into my tent, heart pounding, and zipped it shut, as if that flimsy layer of nylon could protect me. I lay there, listening, as the footsteps stopped just outside. Then, something began scratching at the tent, long, slow scrapes that sent shivers down my spine. I was frozen, too scared to move, barely daring to breathe. Then I heard it, a voice soft and whispery, right outside the tent. It was my grandfather's voice, clear as day. "You shouldn't have come here," it said. "It's not safe anymore." I felt a surge of relief, thinking maybe this was all some cruel prank, some twisted way of him teaching me a lesson even from beyond the grave. But then I remembered. My grandfather had died years ago. There was no way it could be him, and that's when the voice changed. It became rougher, more guttural, almost animalistic. The voice began repeating, "Leave now," over and over, louder and louder, until it was practically screaming. In a panic, I grabbed my knife and slashed at the side of the tent, stumbling out into the darkness. The fire had gone out, and the forest was eerily silent again. No chanting, no humming, nothing. But I could feel something watching me, lurking just out of sight. I didn't even pack my things. I just ran, barely able to see where I was going. I tripped and fell more times than I can count, but somehow I made it back to my car by dawn. As I sped down the road, I glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting to see something chasing me. But there was nothing, just the winding road and the trees. I never did find out what was in those woods, but I left everything behind that day, my gear, my tent, even that carved figure. Whatever it was, I didn't want any reminder of it. When I got home, I did some research, hoping to find an explanation. I found stories of old rituals, of ancient beings that guarded the woods, creatures that could take on familiar voices to lure you deeper into the trees. They say if you hear the voice of someone you know in the woods, you should never respond. because it's not them. It's something else, something that wants you to come closer. I still think about that voice sometimes. It was so convincing, so real. And sometimes late at night, I hear it again, whispering from the shadows of my room, calling me back to the woods. The forest was as dark as I'd ever seen it. Sure, I'd been out here plenty of times, but there was something about tonight that felt wrong. I'm a park ranger stationed in a remote region of the Appalachian Mountains, where I've seen all sorts of strange things over the years, but nothing had prepared me for the horrors I would face on that particular night. It started with a call from the ranger station just before sunset. A pair of campers had been reported missing near Black Hollow Trail. The sun was already dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows over the dense forest. I knew that finding them after dark would be difficult, but there was no choice. They'd been out there for 2 nights longer than planned, and in these woods, that's usually bad news. I radioed back, grabbed my flashlight, and set out toward Black Hollow. The hike wasn't long, maybe 3 miles, but it felt like an eternity. The deeper I went, the quieter the woods became, as if the whole forest was holding its breath, waiting. About a mile in, I started hearing sounds, low growls and rustling in the underbrush. I knew there were wolves in the area, but this sounded different, deeper, almost like a growl from an animal that didn't belong. I kept moving, but I felt a chill crawl up my spine, that primal warning sign that something was watching me. I arrived at the campsite to find it deserted. Their tent was there, half collapsed and torn, like something, or someone, had ransacked it. Gear was scattered all over the ground. A smashed flashlight, a ripped sleeping bag, some clothes. I called out, "Hello? Anyone here?" But only silence answered back. Just as I was about to radio in, I saw something move in my peripheral vision, a shadow, flitting between the trees. I snapped my flashlight toward it, and for a split second I saw what I can only describe as a man, but not quite. He was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that seemed to stretch and contort like they didn't have bones. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his face, if you could call it that, was a grotesque mask of twisted features that didn't quite fit together. I stumbled back, tripping over a tree root, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst out of my chest. The figure stood there for a moment, motionless, before melting back into the shadows as if he'd never been there at all. I knew then that I wasn't dealing with any ordinary forest dweller. I was dealing with something ancient, something that belonged to these woods long before any of us did. I scrambled to my feet and ran back toward the trail, but the forest seemed to close in around me. Every step I took seemed to lead me deeper, not closer to the way out. The trees loomed over me, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The air was thick with the smell of decay, as if something had died out here a long time ago and was left to rot. I tried the radio again, but all I got was static. The oppressive silence was shattered by a scream, a human scream. It sounded like a woman's voice, high-pitched and full of terror. I bolted in the direction of the scream, adrenaline pushing me through the thick underbrush. I found a clearing, and in the center of it stood another figure. But this one was different. It was hunched over, covered in matted fur, and its head was that of a dog. But its body, it was human. It had to be at least 7 feet tall. Its eyes glowed a sickly yellow, and it let out a low, guttural growl that vibrated through the ground beneath my feet. The Dogman. I'd heard stories, but I'd never believed them, until now. The creature slowly turned to face me, and that's when I noticed the 2 figures lying at its feet. The campers, or what was left of them. Blood soaked the ground, pooling around their twisted bodies. I could barely recognize them, their faces contorted in an expression of pure horror. I was frozen, too scared to move, my mind racing with thoughts of escape. The Dogman took a step toward me, and I finally snapped out of it, turning and running as fast as I could. My flashlight was bobbing wildly, casting shadows that seemed to reach out and grab at me. The growls grew louder, closer, and I knew that if I stopped, I was done for. After what felt like hours, I burst through the tree line and onto the old service road. I didn't stop running until I reached my truck, fumbling with the keys and finally throwing myself inside. I locked the doors, my hands shaking as I tried to catch my breath. I looked back toward the forest, and for a brief moment, I saw them, the dogman and that tall, twisted figure, standing side by side watching me. Their eyes glowed in the darkness, a haunting reminder that they were still there, still waiting. I drove back to the ranger station in a daze, barely able to speak as I reported what I'd seen. Of course, they didn't believe me. They chalked it up to exhaustion, told me I was seeing things, that I'd let my imagination get the best of me. But I knew what I'd seen, and I knew that those campers were only the latest victims of whatever lurks in those woods. As I left the station that night, I glanced back at the trees, half expecting to see those glowing eyes staring back at me. I didn't see them, but I knew they were there, waiting, watching. And I knew that one day they'd come for me too. The forest is a place of secrets, and some things are better left undiscovered. So if you ever find yourself out here, alone in the woods, and you start to feel that prickling on the back of your neck, that sudden chill that makes your hair stand on end, don't ignore it, because you're not alone, and you might not make it back. It was supposed to be a simple solo camping trip, just me and the wilderness. I'd done it a dozen times before, but this time I decided to push a little deeper into the woods, away from the usual campsites, and closer to the heart of the forest where few people dared to go. The ranger I'd spoken to at the entrance seemed surprised when I told him where I was headed. Most people stick to the marked trails, he'd said, his voice carrying a hint of warning. But if you're set on it, just be careful. People talk about strange things out there. Things that look human, but aren't. I'd shrugged it off. People love to talk, and stories grow with every telling. Besides, I like the idea of the woods being mysterious, of a place where you could still feel alone in the world. By the time I reached the campsite I'd chosen, it was late afternoon. The air was thick with the scent of pine and moss, and the only sounds were the rustling leaves and my own footsteps. It was peaceful, exactly what I'd come for. I set up my tent, built a small fire, and settled in with a book as the sun dipped lower in the sky. As darkness closed in around me, I started to hear things, small, unidentifiable noises coming from just beyond the firelight. It wasn't unusual for animals to be active at night, but there was something about the way these sounds moved that put me on edge. It was as if whatever was out there was circling me, just out of sight. "Get it together," I muttered, poking at the fire to build it up again. But the feeling of being watched only grew stronger, making my skin prickle. I'd been out here hundreds of times before, but I'd never felt like this. I was just about to turn in for the night when I heard a voice, a man's voice, low and calm, coming from the darkness. "Evening," he said. I whipped around, squinting into the trees, but I couldn't see anyone. "Who's there?" I called, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. The man stepped into the firelight, and I recognized the uniform immediately. A park ranger. But he didn't look quite right. His face was too pale, almost waxy, and his eyes were all wrong. They were too dark, like twin pits that seemed to swallow the firelight. "You're camping alone?" he asked, tilting his head slightly, his voice eerily calm. Yeah," I replied, trying to sound casual. "Is there a problem?" He smiled, but it was a strange, twisted sort of smile that made my stomach churn. "Just thought I'd warn you," he said, stepping a little closer. "Strange things out here. You might see something that looks like a man, but it's not a man." I swallowed hard, instinctively taking a step back. "Is that so?" He nodded, his eyes never leaving mine. "The locals call it a skinwalker. Likes to mimic people, voices, sometimes even faces. You'd do well to leave before it finds you." "Thanks for the warning," I said, forcing a smile, though every nerve in my body was screaming at me to run. He just stood there staring at me, his expression unreadable. Finally, without another word, he turned and disappeared back into the darkness. leaving me alone with only the faint crackle of the fire. I didn't sleep much that night. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig sent my heart racing. I kept imagining that ranger's face, his empty eyes, his twisted smile. I tried to convince myself that he was just trying to scare me, that it was all some kind of joke. But deep down I knew something was off. I could feel it. In the early hours of the morning, just before dawn, I heard a familiar voice calling from the darkness. "Help over here." It was the park ranger's voice, but it sounded strange, like it was stretched too thin, echoing through the trees. I froze, straining to see through the dim light, but there was nothing there. Then suddenly I heard it again, closer this time. "Help over here!" My blood ran cold. It wasn't just the voice that was wrong. It was the way it moved, like it was sliding from one place to another, getting closer each time. Without thinking, I grabbed my backpack, doused the fire, and took off down the trail. The voice followed me, repeating the same words over and over, growing louder with each step. As I stumbled through the woods trying to find my way back to the main trail, I caught a glimpse of something in the corner of my eye. It was the park ranger, but his body was twisted, contorted in a way that no human should ever be. His limbs were too long, his face stretched and distorted, and his eyes were nothing but black pits. I ran faster, the blood pounding in my ears, the voice still calling after me, closer and closer. "Help over here!" By the time I reached the trailhead, the sun was just starting to rise, casting a faint light over the trees. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. I glanced back at the woods, half expecting to see that twisted figure emerging from the shadows. But there was nothing there, just the silent trees and the empty trail. I drove straight to the nearest ranger station, desperate to tell someone what had happened. But when I got there, the ranger on duty gave me a strange look. "There haven't been any rangers patrolling that area for months," he said, his brow furrowed. "You're lucky you made it out. We've had more than a few disappearances over the years. Locals say it's the Skinwalker." I didn't argue. I just got back in my car and drove, leaving those cursed woods behind. To this day, I can still hear that voice sometimes, echoing in the back of my mind. It follows me, calling from the darkness, reminding me of the thing that wears a face but isn't human. And I know that if I ever go back, it'll be waiting for me. I've been a park ranger in a small, desolate forest preserve in the Pacific Northwest for almost a decade. It's the kind of place where people only come to camp if they know about it, and most don't. The land is dense with thick pines, and the trails are unmarked and winding, looping back on themselves in strange ways as if they have a mind of their own. It's beautiful in the daylight, but when the sun sinks below the trees, the air gets heavy, and the woods transform into something else entirely. About a year ago, we started getting reports of something disturbing. Campers would show up at my office, wide-eyed and frantic, claiming they heard voices out in the woods, voices of their loved ones. They'd say they saw strange shadows, shapes that didn't move like animals or people should. I'd write down their stories, assure them we'd look into it, and for the most part, we'd chalk it up to overactive imaginations or too much whiskey around the campfire. But one night, I got a call on the radio from a young couple who had ventured way out past the designated campsite. They said they'd seen something that terrified them, and now they were lost. The woman, Emma, was sobbing, saying they'd heard footsteps circling their tent all night. They tried to leave, but the woods seemed to close in on them, making it impossible to find their way back. The man, Dave, was breathless, whispering that there was something stalking them. I took the call seriously. The last thing I wanted was a search and rescue mission for a couple who'd wandered into dangerous territory. I grabbed my flashlight, my gun, and some basic supplies, and headed out to their location. The night was moonless, and the trees cast shadows that seemed to stretch and curl like skeletal fingers around me. Every step felt like I was being swallowed deeper into a place that didn't want me there. As I trudged through the thick underbrush, the usual sounds of the forest, the chirping of crickets, the rustle of leaves, were eerily absent. It was as if the woods were holding their breath. I'd heard stories of the things that supposedly roamed these trees: skinwalkers, dogmen, other creatures that defy logic and description. Local legend said they watched the forest, guarding it jealously, and those who wandered too far were never seen again. The radio crackled and I could barely make out Dave's voice, whispering that they could see something watching them from the trees. He described it as tall, with glowing yellow eyes and a distorted face, like it was wearing the skin of something human, but it wasn't human at all. He went silent, and a chill ran down my spine. I was about 20 minutes from their location and picked up my pace. When I got to their campsite, I found their tent shredded to pieces, as if by enormous claws. There were deep, gouging marks in the earth around the site, tracks that looked like they were made by something with paws, but far larger than any wolf or bear. And then I saw the blood. It was splattered across the tree trunks and soaked into the dirt. There was no sign of Emma or Dave, just a deafening silence pressing down on me, thick and suffocating. I was about to call for backup when I heard it. A voice. It sounded like Emma, calling my name. Her voice echoed through the trees, soft at first, then louder, almost frantic. I spun around, but the forest was empty. Her voice kept calling, closer now, but somehow off, distorted, like someone was imitating her but didn't quite know how a human was supposed to sound. I took a step back, and suddenly, there was a rustling from the bushes behind me. I turned, and there it was, a creature, hunched and covered in matted fur, with long, spindly limbs that didn't bend the right way. Its face was a horrible mash of animal and human features, with teeth that gleamed in the darkness, and those eyes glowing a sickly yellow, locking onto me as if they could see right through me. It took a step forward and then another, moving with an unnatural, jerking gait, like it was trying to mimic a human but failing. I aimed my gun, hands shaking, and fired a shot. The creature let out a shriek, an ear-piercing wail that echoed through the forest, sending a murder of crows flapping into the sky. It turned and disappeared into the shadows, its figure melting into the darkness as if it had never been there. I didn't wait to see if it would come back. I turned and ran, branches whipping my face, roots snagging at my feet, but I didn't dare slow down. When I finally made it back to my cabin, I locked the door, bolted the windows, and tried to steady my breathing. I wanted to radio for help, but when I picked it up, I froze. Through the static, I heard Emma's voice again, whispering my name, asking me to come back. She kept repeating it, over and over, until it faded into a deep, guttural growl. I never found Emma or Dave. The official report listed them as missing, presumed dead. We closed that part of the park indefinitely, but that didn't stop the reports from coming in. Other campers claimed to see figures lurking in the shadows, and a few brave souls said they heard voices that sounded like their loved ones, calling them deeper into the woods. I still work as a ranger, though I don't patrol that area anymore. I don't go out after dark, and I never, ever respond to a voice calling my name from the trees. Because now, I know the truth. Whatever is out there, it's waiting, and it knows us. It remembers us, and it wears our faces, luring the unsuspecting into its lair. I can only hope you don't hear your name echoing through the woods, because if you do, it's already too late. The forest doesn't give back what it takes, and those who wander too far, well, they become part of the trees. I've camped plenty of times before, but Coldwater Canyon was supposed to be different, more remote, wilder. Mia and I wanted an escape from everything, a place where the world couldn't reach us. No phones, no stress, no noise. The online reviews were sparse, but the ones we found all described it as breathtakingly beautiful, isolated, peaceful. We never saw that side of it. The first red flag should have been the town, a little place called Fenlo, about an hour's drive from the canyon. When we stopped for supplies, the locals stared at us like we didn't belong, their eyes narrowing as we pulled into the gas station. It was unnerving. An older man behind the counter glanced at our camping gear and shook his head. He didn't say anything at first, just scanned the items with a slow, deliberate movement before he finally spoke, in a voice barely louder than a whisper. "You going up to Coldwater?" he asked. Mia smiled, oblivious. "Yeah, we've been planning this trip for weeks. The man's face darkened. "Don't stay there after dark," he muttered, avoiding eye contact. "Things ain't right up there." We laughed it off in the car, calling him a superstitious old man. Every small town has its myths, we figured. But there was something in the way he said it, something that stuck with me as we drove the long, winding road deeper into the mountains. The trees grew thicker, the air cooler. Soon, the road narrowed to a dirt path, and Coldwater Canyon welcomed us with towering cliffs and a thick forest that seemed to swallow the light. We set up camp in a clearing by the creek, the air crisp and clean. The sound of rushing water was soothing, and for a moment, everything felt perfect. Mia was in her element, laughing as we gathered wood for the fire and talked about the long hike we'd planned for the next day. It felt like we were the only two people left in the world. As the sun began to set, a strange unease crept over me. It started with small things. The way the wind moved through the trees, it had a low, mournful quality, almost like a voice whispering in the distance. The shadows stretched unnaturally long, and the silence between the wind gusts felt heavy, pressing in on us. I didn't say anything to Mia. I didn't want to spoil the mood. The first night passed without incident, though I barely slept. Every time I started to drift off, I'd hear a faint rustling just outside the tent. Not like an animal. It was too slow, too deliberate. Mia was out cold, oblivious to my growing anxiety, and by morning, I convinced myself it was nothing, just nerves. We spent the day hiking up to the ridge, the view from the top stunning, almost enough to push the previous night's worries from my mind. Almost. But something about the forest below felt wrong. The trees, so densely packed together, seemed to move, shift in ways they shouldn't. It was like the forest was watching us. When I mentioned it to Mia, she laughed and said I was being paranoid. That night things got worse. It started around midnight. We were sitting by the fire, watching the flames crackle and pop when Mia froze, staring into the woods. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. I hadn't, not at first. But when I listened closely, there it was, a faint tapping, like someone knocking on wood. It was rhythmic, coming from deep within the forest, and it grew louder, closer, with each tap. I stood up, shining my flashlight toward the trees, but there was nothing. Just the dense, impenetrable wall of pine and shadow. Tap, tap, tap. The sound stopped. The forest was silent, except for the crackling fire and the soft trickle of the creek nearby. Mia was on edge now, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was out there just beyond the light watching us. Then, out of nowhere, Mia gasped. She pointed toward the edge of the clearing, her hand trembling. I followed her gaze and saw it. Eyes. Reflective, unblinking eyes staring at us from the tree line. At first I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or a coyote, but these eyes were wrong. They were too high off the ground, too wide apart, and they didn't move, didn't blink. Just stared. We both stood frozen, the fire casting flickering shadows across the clearing, but the eyes didn't flinch. My heart pounded in my chest as I slowly backed away, pulling Mia with me toward the tent. I didn't dare look away from the tree line, but as we retreated, the eyes remained fixed on us, glowing faintly in the firelight. We zipped ourselves into the tent, our breaths shallow, trying to make sense of what we'd seen. I whispered to Mia that it was probably just an animal, trying to convince her as much as myself. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was out there wasn't an animal. It was something else. The tapping resumed. It was closer now, just outside the tent, circling us. Tap, tap, tap. Each knock was measured, deliberate, as if something or someone was toying with us. Mia gripped my hand so tightly it hurt, but I didn't dare move. I didn't dare breathe. Then came the scratching. Soft at first, like nails dragging across the nylon fabric of the tent. It moved slowly, methodically, tracing the edges of the tent. Mia's eyes were wide, tears pooling in the corners, but we were both too terrified to move. The scratching stopped suddenly, and the silence that followed was suffocating. Minutes passed, maybe hours. I don't know. Time seemed to stretch on forever, and we stayed frozen in place, waiting for the next sound, the next movement. It never came. By dawn, the forest seemed normal again. The birds were chirping, the wind had returned, and the sun filtered through the trees like everything was fine. But the unease lingered. Neither of us talked about what had happened. We didn't need to. We both knew something was wrong with Coldwater Canyon. We packed up in silence, ready to leave as quickly as possible. But as we began the hike back toward the car, we noticed something strange. The trail, the one we had followed in so easily, was different. It wound in directions we didn't recognize, twisting through unfamiliar parts of the forest. Landmarks we had passed the day before were missing, as if the forest had shifted in the night. Panic set in quickly. We hiked for hours, but no matter which way we went, we couldn't find the trailhead. The sun was high in the sky, but the deeper we went into the woods, the darker it seemed to get, the trees growing thicker and more oppressive. And then we saw it. Carved into the trunks of several trees were symbols, strange angular shapes like runes. They were old, weathered, but clearly deliberate. And the further we walked, the more we saw, scattered throughout the forest, marking the trees like a warning. The tapping returned. It was closer this time, echoing through the woods, coming from every direction. Mia and I spun around, our eyes wide with fear, but there was no one there. Nothing. Just the trees, the symbols, and the sound. And then we saw the eyes again, dozens of them, lurking in the shadows between the trees, glowing faintly in the dim light. They watched us, unblinking, unrelenting. This time there was no doubt. They weren't animals. They were waiting. We ran. Branches tore at our clothes, our skin, but we didn't care. We just ran, our breath ragged, our hearts pounding in our chests. The eyes followed, keeping pace with us, always just out of sight, just beyond the next tree. By some miracle, we stumbled onto the road. I don't remember how we got there, but we didn't stop. We ran until we saw the car, threw our gear inside, and sped out of Coldwater Canyon, never looking back. We didn't speak for the entire drive back, but I knew Mia felt it too. The lingering presence, the sense that we had barely escaped something ancient, something wrong. I still see the eyes sometimes in my dreams, staring at me from the shadows, waiting. I've always been a sucker for the quiet, the solitude of the wilderness. I craved it. When I was younger, my dad and I would disappear into the woods for days at a time, living off the land, sleeping under the stars. So when my friends bailed on our annual camping trip last minute, I didn't care. I'd go solo. A weekend away, deep in the forest, sounded perfect. Or at least, it should have been. The trail was familiar, one I'd hiked a dozen times before. I knew every twist, every tree, every hidden stream. After hours of walking, I found the perfect spot, a clearing surrounded by thick pines, just far enough off the main trail to feel truly isolated. I set up my tent as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows through the trees. That first night started off normal enough. I lit a small fire, cracked open a beer, and just listened. The woods were alive, chirping insects, distant rustling, typical forest sounds. As the fire crackled and the night deepened, I felt the tension of city life melt away. But as the stars began to disappear behind a thick layer of clouds, something changed. The noises of the forest, once so calming, suddenly felt different, off. The rustling, the chirping, even the wind seemed to quiet, like the woods were holding their breath. And then I heard it, this low, distant hum. It was faint, barely audible over the dying fire, but persistent, like a far-off engine that never got closer, never faded away. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination playing tricks, but I couldn't shake this strange, nagging feeling crawling up my spine. I doused the fire, climbed into my tent, and tried to sleep. I must have drifted off at some point, but the next thing I knew, I was wide awake, staring up at the ceiling of my tent, every nerve in my body on edge. A twig snapped outside, the sharp crack echoing through the stillness. I held my breath, listening, straining to hear past the pounding of my heart. Another sound, footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling my tent. My mind raced. A bear? No, bears are clumsy. Whatever was out there wasn't. I grabbed my flashlight, my hand trembling as I clicked it on. The beam sliced through the darkness, casting long shadows across the nylon walls of my tent. I waited, praying the noises would stop, that whatever it was would leave. But the footsteps didn't stop. They grew closer, circling again and again, pacing, like it was trying to make up its mind about something. I could hear it breathing, low, raspy, unnatural. Suddenly, the side of my tent bulged inward, like someone, was pressing their hand against it. I could see the faint outline of fingers through the fabric. Too human, too close. I bolted upright, unzipping the tent and bursting into the night air, my flashlight darting wildly through the trees. Nothing. No one. The forest was empty, but that hum, louder now, drifted through the trees like a warning. I stood there for what felt like hours, just waiting, every hair on my body standing on end. Eventually, the footsteps stopped. The forest went silent again, but I couldn't sleep after that. I spent the rest of the night sitting by the fire, jumping at every whisper of wind, every crackle of the embers. When dawn finally broke, I packed up my gear, ready to get the hell out of there. But as I was about to leave, I found something. Right outside my tent, pressed into the dirt, were footprints. Not animal tracks, human footprints. But they weren't mine. These were larger, barefoot, fresh. I hurried back to the trail, refusing to look over my shoulder. I felt watched the entire hike back, that same low hum vibrating through the trees, growing louder with every step. By the time I reached my car, it was practically a roar in my ears. I jumped in, slammed the door, and floored it out of there, not daring to look into the rearview mirror. For the next week, I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks. But the hum stayed with me. At night, I'd hear it faintly, coming from somewhere outside my apartment. I told myself it was the city, background noise, traffic, but it never went away. It just kept getting louder. 2 days ago, I woke up to find dirt on my bedroom floor, footprints, bare, human footprints leading from the door to my bed. I moved out yesterday. But tonight, as I sit in this motel room, miles away from the forest, from my old apartment, I hear it again, that hum. Low, persistent, right outside my window. And this time it's accompanied by footsteps. They're circling, just like before. Only now I'm nowhere near the woods. The unsettling hum and footsteps weren't confined to the forest. Whatever followed the narrator home seems to have bridged the gap between reality and something darker, more sinister. The noises, so unexplainable and seemingly tied to the wilderness, now haunt the narrator wherever he goes, showing that no place, no distance can separate him from whatever has marked him. The isolation and dread aren't from the woods themselves, but from something much closer, something that's found him and refuses to let go. Camping has always been my escape from the chaos of life. No deadlines, no emails, no noise, just me and the wilderness. I thought this trip would be no different, but I was wrong. Very wrong. It was late summer when I decided to take a solo trip to Pine Ridge Forest, a place I'd heard about but never visited. It was remote, far from any major trails, and that was exactly what I wanted. I needed the isolation, the quiet, a chance to clear my head. I arrived late afternoon, parked my car at a small gravel lot near the trailhead. and he could about 3 miles into the woods. The forest felt entuched, ancient even. The trees towered above me, their branches intertwining like they were trying to keep something hidden beneath them. I found a small clearing next to a creek and decided to set up camp. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, my fire was crackling, casting long shadows across the trees. The air was cool, and the forest around me buzzed with the usual sounds: crickets, rustling leaves, the occasional owl hoot. It was peaceful, exactly what I had hoped for. But then, as night truly settled in, the atmosphere began to change. The forest grew unnaturally quiet. The crickets stopped chirping. The wind that had been gently swaying the branches above suddenly stilled. I sat by the fire, poking at the flames, trying to ignore the silence pressing in around me. It was unsettling. Then I heard it, a sound that still makes my skin crawl when I think about it. At first, it was faint, like a far-off echo. It was a laugh. Not a cheerful, hearty laugh, but something wrong. It was distant, yet distinct, almost like it was inside my head. I stood up, shining my flashlight into the dark woods. The beam flickered across the trees, revealing nothing but endless darkness beyond the circle of my campfire. The laugh stopped as soon as the light hit the edge of the clearing. I tried to calm myself down, telling myself it was just the wind or my imagination playing tricks. But deep down, I knew something was off. I sat back down, trying to focus on the fire, but then it came again, this time closer. It sounded like a child's laugh, soft, high-pitched, but with no joy in it. It sent a shiver down my spine. "Hello?" I called out, feeling foolish for speaking into the darkness. There was no reply, just the oppressive silence. I sat there for what felt like hours, gripping my flashlight in one hand, the fire crackling weakly at my feet. But the laugh didn't return. Maybe it had just been my imagination after all. Finally, the tension eased, and I decided to turn in for the night. I zipped myself up in my tent, the warmth of my sleeping bag wrapping around me, and for a while, the quiet felt comforting. But as I started to drift off, I heard something that made my blood turn to ice. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, and heavy. Someone or something was walking just outside my tent. I lay perfectly still, my breath shallow, straining to hear more. The steps were uneven, as though whatever it was dragging one foot or limping. The sound moved closer, circling my tent. I reached for my flashlight, my hand shaking as I clicked it on. The beam pierced the fabric of the tent, casting long, distorted shadows outside. The footsteps stopped, but I could hear something breathing. Deep, ragged breaths, just inches from where I lay. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. I just lay there paralyzed with fear. Then, as suddenly as it had come, the breathing stopped. I waited, heart pounding, for what felt like an eternity. But nothing else happened. No more footsteps, no more breathing, and I didn't sleep at all that night. When the first light of dawn finally crept into the clearing, I cautiously unzipped the tent and stepped outside. The air was still cold, and a thin layer of dew clung to everything. I scanned the campsite, expecting to find footprints or some sign of what had been out there. But there was nothing. The ground was undisturbed, the fire reduced to ashes, and the creek bubbled along as though nothing had happened. I tried to shake off the unease, convincing myself that it had been a dream, that the isolation was just playing tricks on me. But as I packed up my gear, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. Just beyond the clearing, carved deep into the trunk of a tree, were 3 words: "We found you." The letters were jagged, almost gouged into the bark, like they had been scratched in a hurry. My hands shook as I touched the rough cuts, fresh and unmistakable. I hadn't heard anything like carving in the night. I should have heard something, but I hadn't. I grabbed my pack and left, walking fast, almost running down the trail, my pulse pounding in my ears. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see something watching me from the trees, but I never did. The hike back felt longer than the way in, and when I finally reached the car, I jumped in and sped out of there, not looking back once. To this day, I can't explain what happened. I've gone over it in my head 100 times trying to find some rational explanation. But that laugh, those footsteps, and the words carved into the tree. I can't shake the feeling that something followed me out of those woods. And every now and then, late at night, I hear that same laugh, soft, high-pitched, just beyond the edge of my hearing. I haven't been camping since.